Shopping malls, bright, bustling centers of life and commerce by day, transform into something entirely different when the lights go out. The cheerful music and crowds are replaced by silence, shadows, and an eerie sense of abandonment. For those who work the graveyard shift, this change isn't just unsettling. It's a reminder that malls, like all places built by human hands, have their secrets. This story begins at the Willows Creek Mall, where a young man named Mark Travers learned that some secrets are better left undiscovered. Mark Travers was 26 years old, a college dropout, and like many in his small town, struggling to make ends meet. His life wasn't glamorous. Days spent delivering groceries, nights playing video games in his tiny apartment. When his friend Alex mentioned an opening for a night security guard at the local mall, Mark jumped at the chance. "It's easy money," Alex had said, shrugging. "You walk around a bit, watch some cameras, and try not to fall asleep. The place is dead at night." That was an understatement. Willows Creek Mall had been a staple of the town since the late 1970s. It was massive for such a small community, with over 100 stores, a sprawling food court, and even an indoor ice rink. During the day, it bustled with activity, but by night, it became a hollow shell. Mark's first impression of the mall at night was unsettling. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made every sound seem amplified. The hum of the fluorescent lights echoed in the empty corridors, and his footsteps seemed to follow him like an uninvited guest. On his first shift, Mark met his supervisor, Hank, a grizzled man in his late 50s. Hank had been working at the mall since it opened. He had the look of someone who had seen too much and cared too little. "Here's the deal," Hank said, handing Mark a flashlight and a set of keys. "You'll be stationed in the security office most of the time. Keep an eye on the monitors, do a walkthrough every couple of hours, and don't go wandering off. Stick to the main corridors. No shortcuts, no backrooms." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Backrooms?" Hank's expression darkened. "This place is bigger than it looks. Lots of storage areas and old service tunnels. Easy to get lost if you're not careful." Mark chuckled. "Sounds like you're trying to scare me." "I'm not," Hank said flatly. "I'm telling you to follow the rules. You hear something weird? Ignore it. You see something on the cameras? Stay in the office. And whatever you do, don't mess with the lights." Mark frowned but nodded. "Got it." Hank's warning seemed over the top, but Mark didn't care. It was just another job, and he needed the money. The first few hours of his shift were uneventful. Mark sat in the small, cluttered security office, sipping stale coffee and watching the monitors. The screens displayed grainy footage of the mall's empty halls and shuttered storefronts. Occasionally, a cleaning crew would appear, vacuuming or mopping, but by midnight, even they were gone. The boredom was almost comforting, until it wasn't. At around 1:15 a.m., Mark noticed something strange on one of the monitors. A faint movement near the food court caught his eye. He squinted at the screen, adjusting the brightness. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow dart across the frame. "Probably nothing," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. But the shadow appeared again, this time near the ice rink. Mark rewound the footage, but it was gone. He shook his head, blaming the poor camera quality. Still, the feeling lingered that something wasn't right. During his first walkthrough, Mark kept his flashlight close, the beam cutting through the darkness. The mall felt different at night. The mannequins in the store windows seemed to watch him, their glass eyes reflecting the faint light. The food court was eerily still. Chairs were stacked on tables, and the scent of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air. Mark's footsteps echoed off the tiled floor, each step louder than the last. He paused near the ice rink, staring at the smooth, empty surface. The air was colder here, almost biting. For a moment, he thought he heard a faint scraping sound, like skates gliding over ice. He swung his flashlight toward the rink, but it was empty. Shaking off the unease, he returned to the security office. By 3 a.m., the monitors began to flicker. Static danced across the screens, and the faint shadow appeared again, moving from one camera to the next. Mark leaned forward, his pulse quickening. This time, the shadow lingered, standing still at the edge of a frame near the food court. Mark grabbed his flashlight and headed out. The walk to the food court felt longer than before. The air seemed heavier, the silence deeper. When he arrived, the space was empty, just as he'd expected. But then he saw it. Near one of the tables, a single chair was pulled out, its legs scraping against the floor as though someone had just sat down. Mark froze, his flashlight beam trembling. "Hello," he called out. His voice echoed, unanswered. He backed away, keeping the light trained on the chair. As he turned to leave, his flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, he heard it, a faint whisper, too low to make out the words. Mark didn't stick around to investigate. He sprinted back to the security office, locking the door behind him. When Hank arrived the next morning, he found Mark pale and jittery. "Long night?" Hank asked, smirking. Mark nodded, reluctant to share what he'd seen. But Hank seemed to know. "You'll get used to it," Hank said. "Or you won't." "What is this place?" Mark asked. Hank shrugged. "It's just a mall, kid. You're the one bringing ghosts into it." Mark wanted to argue, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Hank wasn't telling him everything. And he was right. Mark's second night on the job started the same way as the first. The mall was silent, the security office dimly lit by the glow of the monitors. But as the hours crept by, he began to notice patterns, strange movements that didn't seem to belong. It wasn't the cleaning crew, nor was it a trick of the outdated cameras. Something or someone was moving in the shadows. Mark leaned back in his chair, trying to ignore the faint static that occasionally disrupted the feed. The monitors displayed the usual scenes: the empty corridors, the closed storefronts, the food court. He told himself it was just another quiet shift. But at 12:47 a.m., the shadow returned. This time, it appeared near the East Wing, a part of the mall Mark hadn't yet explored. The shadow was faint, almost humanoid, but its movements were wrong, jerky, as though it was trying to mimic walking. Mark rewound the footage, watching the shadow dart across the frame. It stopped in front of a store called Breyer's Antiques, then disappeared. He felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't seen anyone enter the mall that night. Mark grabbed his flashlight and hesitated. Hank's words echoed in his mind. "Stick to the cameras. Don't go exploring." But curiosity won out. The East Wing was darker than the rest of the mall, the lights overhead flickering every few seconds. As Mark walked, he noticed something strange. The air felt colder here, as though the heat from the rest of the building didn't reach this area. When he reached Breyer's Antiques, he found the store shuttered, its display window covered in a thick layer of dust. The shadow couldn't have gone inside. It was impossible. He moved closer, shining his flashlight through the gap between the shutters. Inside, he saw rows of old furniture, porcelain dolls, and mirrors. The beam of his light reflected off one of the mirrors, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement. But it wasn't his reflection. The mirror rippled, as though its surface was made of water. Mark stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. The air grew colder, and he heard a faint sound, laughter, distant and hollow. He turned to leave, but the sound followed him, growing louder. When he glanced back at the store, the shadow was there, standing behind the shutters, staring at him. Mark sprinted back to the security office, slamming the door shut. He stared at the monitors, expecting to see the shadow again, but the screens were blank. The static had returned, crackling softly. For the rest of the night, Mark stayed in the office, too afraid to leave. The laughter echoed in his mind, long after it stopped. By his third night, Mark had begun to question why he'd taken the job at all. The silence of the mall was no longer peaceful. It felt suffocating. And then there was the shadow, the laughter, the strange coldness in the East Wing. But curiosity has a way of pulling us toward the things we should avoid. Mark arrived for his shift just after 10 p.m. Hank was there waiting for him, a rare occurrence. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Hank said, leaning against the desk. Mark hesitated. I thought I saw something last night. Near the East Wing, Hank's face darkened. "I told you to stick to the main corridors." "I know, but..." "Listen, kid," Hank interrupted. "This place is old. It's got a history, and not all of it's good. You don't want to go digging where you don't belong." Mark frowned but didn't press further. Hank left shortly after, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts and the monitors. Around midnight, the static returned. Mark watched as the shadow flickered across the screens, moving with purpose. This time, it headed toward an area he hadn't seen before. A corridor marked authorized personnel only. Mark's heart raced. He remembered Hank's warning, but something about the shadow's movements felt intentional. It wasn't random, it was leading him somewhere. Grabbing his flashlight, Mark left the security office and followed the shadow's path. The corridor was long and narrow, its walls lined with pipes and electrical panels. The air was damp, and the faint hum of machinery echoed around him. Mark walked slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At the end of the hall, he found a heavy metal door. It was slightly ajar, the faint sound of whispering seeping through the gap. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was unlike anything he had expected. It was cluttered with old decorations, broken mannequins, and crates covered in dust. The smell of mildew was overwhelming. But what caught Mark's attention was the object in the center of the room, an ornate mirror. The mirror was massive, its frame carved with intricate patterns that seemed to twist and shift under the flashlight's beam. The glass was dark, almost black, and Mark's reflection appeared distorted, as though it belonged to someone else. He stepped closer, the whispering growing louder. It wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from the mirror. Mark froze as the glass began to ripple. His reflection disappeared, replaced by the shadow. It stared at him, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the door slammed shut behind him. Mark turned, but the shadow didn't move. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Mark stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The shadow reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and for a moment, Mark thought it might step through. But then the whispering stopped, and the room fell silent. Mark didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted for the door, slamming it behind him as he ran back to the security office. For the rest of the night, Mark stayed locked in the security office, his hands trembling as he clutched his flashlight. The monitors were blank, the static gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still watching him. When morning came, Mark left the mall without a word. He didn't speak to Hank, didn't look back, but deep down, he knew he couldn't leave things unresolved. The shadow, the whispers, the mirror, each had pushed Mark closer to a horrifying realization. The mall wasn't just a place of commerce and memories. It was something far older, something that carried a darkness woven into its very foundation. By his fourth night, Mark knew he had to confront Hank. What he didn't know was just how much Hank had been hiding. Mark arrived early for his shift, catching Hank before he left for the night. "Why didn't you tell me about the mirror?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking. Hank paused, his hand on the door. "You went to the back room, didn't you?" Mark nodded. "What is it? What's wrong with this place?" Hank sighed and gestured for Mark to sit. "You ever wonder why a mall like this was built in a town like ours?" Mark frowned. He never thought about it before. Willows Creek was small, barely large enough to support a shopping plaza, let alone a massive mall. This land, Hank began, it wasn't always empty. Before the mall, there was a sanitarium here, a place for people society didn't know what to do with. The kind of place where things happened that were better left forgotten. Mark leaned forward, his heart pounding. When the sanitarium closed in the 1950s, the land sat empty for years, Hank continued. Then some developer came along, said he wanted to build something big. But the construction crew started having problems. Accidents, workers going missing. People said it was cursed. Mark's stomach turned. What does this have to do with the mirror? Hank hesitated. The developer brought that mirror to the site himself. Said it was a centerpiece for the mall. But the workers refused to touch it. Said it wasn't right. So it stayed in storage, locked away. Until now. Mark's mind raced as he processed Hank's words. The pieces were starting to come together. The shadow, the cold, the whispers. The mirror wasn't just a relic. It was a gateway. That night, Mark made a decision. He had to go back to the mirror to find out what it was hiding. When the mall closed and the lights dimmed, Mark made his way back to the forbidden corridor. This time, he brought more than a flashlight. He carried a crowbar, determined to smash the mirror if he had to. The walk felt longer than before, the air heavier. When he reached the storage room, the door creaked open on its own. The mirror stood in the center of the room, its surface dark and still. Mark approached cautiously, the crowbar trembling in his hand. He stared at his reflection, his breath visible in the freezing air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the glass rippled, and the shadow appeared again. This time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of figures emerged from the mirror, their forms barely human. They surrounded Mark, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The whispering returned, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have come here," the shadow said again, its voice resonating through the room. Mark swung the crowbar, shattering the mirror with a deafening crash. The figures dissolved into smoke, and the room fell silent. But as Mark turned to leave, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The shards of the mirror lay scattered across the floor, each reflecting his face, but none of them were moving the way he was. By the fifth night, Mark was running on fear and adrenaline. He had shattered the mirror, but instead of ending the nightmare, it seemed to have unleashed something far worse. The mall's silence now felt alive, and the shadow was no longer confined to the cameras. This wasn't just another shift. This was the night Mark discovered the truth about what he had awakened. Mark arrived for his shift later than usual, hesitating in his car as he stared at the glowing entrance of the mall. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to quit, and never look back. But he couldn't. Something about the mall, about the shadow, was pulling him back. As he walked through the empty corridors, the air felt heavier than ever. The lights flickered more frequently, and a low hum resonated through the walls. It was as if the mall itself was alive, waiting for him. Mark sat in the security office, his eyes glued to the monitors. The screens crackled with static, but through the distortion, he saw them. Shadows moving in unison, heading toward the center of the mall. The center, that was where the ice rink was, the coldest part of the building, and the one place Mark hadn't fully explored. Grabbing his flashlight, Mark made his way to the rink. The air grew colder with every step, his breath forming clouds in front of him. When he reached the rink, the lights above it flickered once, then went out entirely. The only light came from his flashlight, which barely cut through the darkness. The ice was smooth and unmarked, but the faint sound of skates echoed through the empty space. Mark called out, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" The sound stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, slowly, the shadow emerged from the darkness, gliding across the ice. It wasn't alone. Figures began to materialize, stepping out of the walls, their forms flickering like static. They surrounded the rink, their hollow eyes fixed on Mark. "You let us out," the shadow said, its voice a low rumble that shook the air. Mark backed away, his flashlight flickering. "What do you want?" The shadow tilted its head. "To go home?" Suddenly, the figures surged toward Mark, their movements jerky and unnatural. He stumbled back, tripping over a loose tile. The flashlight skidded across the floor, plunging him into darkness. Mark scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He could hear them, whispers growing louder, closer. Desperate, he ran. He didn't know where he was going, but his instincts pushed him toward the exit. The shadows followed, their whispers turning to screams. When he reached the main entrance, he found it locked. The glass doors, which should have been automatic, wouldn't budge. Behind him, the shadows closed in. In a moment of clarity, Mark remembered the security office. The cameras. If he could just make it back there, he could figure out what was happening. He sprinted through the halls, the shadows trailing behind him. When he reached the office, he slammed the door shut and locked it. The monitors were filled with static, but through the distortion, Mark saw something he hadn't noticed before. In every frame, faint symbols were etched into the walls and floors of the mall. Rituals. The pieces clicked into place. The developer Hank had mentioned the mirror, the shadows, they were all part of something ancient, something that had been sealed away when the mall was built. Breaking the mirror had unleashed it. Mark grabbed the walkie-talkie on the desk and called Hank, hoping he'd pick up. To his relief, Hank's voice crackled through the static. "Hank," Mark gasped, "I broke the mirror. They're everywhere." What do I do? There was a long pause before Hank replied. You can't stop them, kid, but you can contain them. Get to the generator room. Cut the power. It's the only way. Mark didn't ask questions. He grabbed the keys and made his way to the basement. The generator room was colder than the rest of the mall, the air thick with an unnatural energy. Mark could feel the shadows pressing in, watching him. When he reached the main panel, he hesitated. Cutting the power would plunge the mall into complete darkness, but he had no choice. As he flipped the switch, the lights went out and the mall fell silent. For a moment, Mark thought it had worked. Then he heard the laughter. It wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, echoing through the halls, growing louder. The last thing Mark saw before the shadows consumed him was his own reflection in the glass panel of the generator. A reflection that didn't match his movements. The next morning, the mall opened as usual. Shoppers filled the halls, unaware of what had happened the night before. The security office was empty, Mark's belongings left behind. Hank quit the next day, refusing to explain why. The new security guard lasted 2 weeks before walking out without a word. And on quiet nights, when the mall is empty, the cameras still pick up shadows moving through the halls. Some say it's just glitches in the system, but others know the truth. Shopping malls are designed to be places of comfort. Bright lights, familiar stores, and spaces filled with laughter. But when something doesn't quite fit, the dissonance can turn even the most inviting mall into a labyrinth of fear. This is the story of a mall that defied the laws of reality, a place where floors vanished, time unraveled, and the people who entered didn't always come back. In October 2003, the Riverside Galleria opened its doors for the first time. The mall was a massive structure, spanning 5 stories with gleaming escalators, an atrium filled with natural light, and a glass roof that offered a stunning view of the sky. It was a marvel of architecture, built on the outskirts of Meadowview, a small town eager for a modern shopping experience. The Galleria promised everything: luxury brands, a sprawling food court, and even an indoor amusement park on the top floor. The grand opening was a spectacle. Hundreds of people flooded the mall, eager to explore its wonders. But amid the excitement, a few attendees noticed something strange. The layout felt off. The escalators seemed to change directions without warning. Storefronts that were there one moment would disappear the next. And then there were the floors. Shoppers swore that some didn't exist at all, even though the directories clearly listed them. At first, the anomalies were dismissed as confusion. But as the weeks went on, the rumors grew. 3 weeks after the Galleria's opening, a local teenager named Sarah Holloway went missing. She had gone to the mall with friends, but separated from the group to visit a store on the 4th floor. When her friends returned to meet her, she was gone. Security footage showed Sarah stepping onto an escalator, heading toward the 4th floor. But when the footage was reviewed, something strange appeared. The escalator didn't lead anywhere. It simply faded into darkness. The footage cut to static, and Sarah was never seen again. Her disappearance shook the town, but the mall management insisted it was unrelated to the building. They claimed Sarah must have left the premises unnoticed. But Sarah's friends knew better. She said she felt like the floors were moving, one of them told reporters. Like the mall was alive. Mark Hill, the mall's head of security, was tasked with investigating Sarah's disappearance. A former police officer, Mark wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. But as he reviewed the footage and spoke with staff, he began to notice a pattern. Employees on the late shift reported hearing footsteps on empty floors, doors opening and closing on their own, and a strange hum that seemed to come from nowhere. Mark dismissed most of the claims, chalking them up to overactive imaginations. But one detail stood out. The complaints always came from the 4th floor. Late one night, Mark decided to investigate the 4th floor himself. Armed with a flashlight, he took the escalator up, his steps echoing in the empty mall. When he reached the 4th floor, the air felt different, thick and heavy, like a storm was brewing. The stores were dark, their signs unlit. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the walls. Mark walked cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the empty halls. Then he saw it, A store that wasn't on the directory, a small shop with no name, its glass doors slightly ajar. Mark stepped inside, his flashlight flickering as if the air itself was interfering with the beam. The store was unlike anything he had seen before. The shelves were lined with objects that didn't belong. Antique toys, rusted tools, faded photographs, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. At the center of the room was a display case. Inside, a single object caught Mark's attention, a key. The key was ornate, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the light. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "To unlock what was never meant to be found." Mark reached for the key, but as soon as he touched it, the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend and stretch, the hum growing into a deafening roar. The next thing Mark knew, he was standing in the atrium, but it wasn't the same. The escalators were frozen mid-motion, the glass ceiling cracked and leaking water. The mall was empty, its once bright lights flickering. Mark looked around, disoriented. He was still holding the key. As he wandered through the distorted mall, Mark noticed something chilling. The stores were gone, replaced by endless corridors that looped back on themselves. The air was cold, and his breath fogged in front of him. He tried the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. His phone had no signal, and the emergency call boxes were dead. And then he heard it, footsteps echoing through the halls. Mark turned, but the corridors were empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Suddenly, a figure stepped into view. It was Sarah Holloway, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," she whispered. Before Mark could respond, she was pulled back into the shadows by an unseen force. By the time Mark realized he wasn't alone in the mall, it was too late to turn back. The Galleria wasn't just a place of commerce. It was something far older, something designed for a purpose no one could comprehend. Mark had stepped into a world that defied logic, a labyrinth where reality bent, time unraveled, and the walls whispered secrets meant to stay buried. Mark stood frozen in the atrium, the echoes of Sarah Holloway's plea still ringing in his ears. He clutched the key, its weight feeling heavier than it should. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by a low hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls around him. He needed answers, and he knew where to find them. Mark made his way back to the unmarked store. This time, the door was wide open, and the eerie glow from inside cast long, shifting shadows across the floor. The store seemed larger now, its shelves stretching into the darkness. The objects were no longer random. They seemed to be watching him, their shapes twisting whenever he turned away. At the center of the room, where the key had been, was now a map. The map wasn't of the mall, or at least not the mall as Mark knew it. It showed a sprawling structure, far larger than the Galleria, with corridors that spiraled into endless loops. Mark recognized some of the areas, the atrium, the food court, but others were unfamiliar, marked with cryptic symbols. One symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it, was located on the 4th floor. Beneath it was a single word, portal. Mark's flashlight flickered, and the hum grew louder. He turned to leave, but the store's exit had vanished. The shelves began to close in, their contents rattling as though alive. Mark backed away, clutching the map, when the walls themselves seemed to split open. Through the crack, Mark saw the 4th floor, but not as it should have been. The corridors were dark and pulsing, like veins carrying something unseen. Shadows moved along the walls, their shapes shifting and merging. Mark stumbled forward, the crack widening to swallow him whole. He landed in a corridor unlike any he had seen before. The air was thick, and the walls glistened as though they were alive. The ground beneath him felt unstable, like walking on the surface of a drum. Ahead, the corridor opened into a massive room, a circular space with no visible ceiling. In the center was a glowing structure, a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Mark felt his knees weaken. The map had called it a portal, but it looked more like a wound, something torn open and left to fester. Around the portal stood figures, their forms barely human. They moved in unison, their heads tilted toward the vortex, as if listening to something only they could hear. Mark crept closer, his breath shallow. The figures didn't react to him. their focus entirely on the portal. And then he saw her. Sarah Holloway stood near the edge of the vortex, her expression blank. She was holding an object, a small, ornate box etched with the same symbols as the key. Mark called out to her, but she didn't respond. One of the figures turned toward him, its face featureless, but its presence overwhelming. "You should not be here," it said, its voice echoing in Mark's mind. Mark raised the key, unsure of what to do. The figure tilted its head, as if recognizing the object. "You opened the way," it said. "Now you must close it." The Galleria had revealed its secrets, and Mark now stood at the heart of its nightmare. The portal before him was alive, a gaping wound in reality, guarded by beings that defied comprehension. To close it, he would have to face not just the mall's darkness, but his own deepest fears. Mark gripped the key tightly, its etched surface digging into his palm. The figure that had addressed him stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "You must close what was opened," it said, the words reverberating in Mark's skull. "The key, the box, they are one." Mark's gaze shifted to Sarah. She stood near the vortex, holding the ornate box as if in a trance. The swirling light and shadow of the portal reflected in her glassy eyes, and her lips moved silently, as though repeating a chant he couldn't hear. "Sarah," Mark called, his voice cracking. She didn't respond. The other figures turned toward him, their hollow faces now focused entirely on the key in his hand. The air around the portal grew heavier, pulling Mark toward its center. The figures began to move, forming a circle around the vortex. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their heads tilting in unison as they chanted in a language Mark didn't recognize. The vortex expanded, its edges flickering like flames. Mark felt a pull deep in his chest, as though the portal was reaching for something inside him. The key in his hand grew warmer, the symbols glowing faintly. Mark stumbled forward, struggling to resist the pull of the portal. One of the figures stepped aside, gesturing towards Sarah. "She is the vessel," it said, "but you are the catalyst." Mark's mind raced. The map, the symbols, the key, it all led here. Whatever this thing was, it had been waiting for him. Summoning his courage, Mark moved towards Sarah. The air near the portal was so thick he could barely breathe. His voice shook as he reached for her. "Sarah, wake up. We have to go." Her eyes flicked toward him, but her expression didn't change. "The box," she whispered, her voice hollow. "It needs the key." Mark glanced at the ornate box in her hands. Its surface was identical to the key, etched with the same swirling symbols. He understood now. The key wasn't just for opening doors, it was for sealing them. As he reached for the box, the portal roared, its light flaring brighter than before. The figures around it began to dissolve, their forms unraveling into streams of shadow that were pulled into the vortex. Mark grabbed the box and inserted the key into its lock. The symbols glowed brighter, and the vortex pulsed violently. The figures screamed, not with fear, but with rage. They lunged toward Mark, their shapes distorting as they fought against the pull of the portal. Sarah's trance broke, and she collapsed to the ground. Mark shielded her as he turned the key. The box clicked, and the vortex shrank, pulling the figures into its depths. The air grew colder, the light dimming until the portal was no more. Mark collapsed, his body trembling. The room was silent now, the oppressive energy gone. He looked at Sarah, who was breathing but unconscious. The box and the key lay on the ground, their glow fading. He knew he had to leave before the mall's reality shifted again. Carrying Sarah, Mark made his way back through the dark corridors. The mall was no longer distorted. The walls and floors had returned to their original state. When he reached the atrium, dawn was breaking through the glass ceiling. He pushed through the exit doors, which opened easily now, and stepped into the cold morning air. Mark never returned to the Galleria. He handed in his resignation and left Meadowview, taking Sarah with him. She never spoke about what had happened, but the haunted look in her eyes told him she remembered everything. The mall remained open, its shoppers oblivious to the horrors beneath its polished floors. But those who worked the late shift whispered of strange occurrences, footsteps in empty corridors, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. And deep in the storage room, where no one dared to go, the ornate box and the key waited for the next unwitting soul. Shopping malls are built to bring people together, to be places of joy and connection. But what happens when they become the site of something unimaginable? This is the story of a quiet mall in the Midwest, a festive Christmas Eve, and a horror that still lingers in the minds of those who survived. It was December 24th, 1998, and the Hillside Mall was bustling with last-minute shoppers. Parents clutched their children's hands as they rushed to grab gifts, and the air was filled with the sound of carols played over the PA system. In the center of the mall stood the annual Christmas Village display, a massive setup featuring fake snow, twinkling lights, and Santa's workshop. Kids lined up to meet Santa Claus, their faces lit with excitement. But not everyone was filled with holiday cheer. In the dimly lit corridors beyond the main atrium, security guard Evelyn Reed was making her rounds. Evelyn had worked at Hillside Mall for over a decade, and she had seen her share of strange things. But this Christmas Eve felt different. The halls were quieter than usual, the shadows longer. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At 8:37 p.m., Evelyn received a call over her radio. A janitor had reported a strange sound coming from one of the unused storage areas on the lower level. Evelyn sighed, already tired from the holiday rush, and headed toward the storage area. The lower level was nearly deserted, most of the stores already closed for the night. Evelyn's footsteps echoed as she made her way down the hall, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. When she reached the storage area, the sound hit her, a low, rhythmic knocking coming from behind a locked door. She radioed her supervisor, but there was no response. "Great," Evelyn muttered, pulling out her keys. As she unlocked the door, the knocking stopped. Inside, the storage room was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and mildew. Evelyn shone her flashlight around the space, her heart pounding. The room was empty, but then she saw it. Footprints in the dust, leading toward a large, covered object in the corner. Evelyn hesitated before approaching the object. It was tall and bulky, draped in a faded white sheet that seemed to ripple slightly in the drafty room. As she pulled back the sheet, her flashlight revealed something unexpected, a large, ornate sleigh. Its paint was chipped and the wood was cracked, but it was undeniably a Christmas sleigh. Evelyn frowned. The mall didn't have a sleigh like this in its decorations, and she couldn't think of any reason for it to be here. She ran her fingers over the carvings along its side, strange symbols she didn't recognize. As she examined the sleigh, her flashlight flickered, and the room grew colder. That's when she noticed the blood. A single, dark streak ran along the inside of the sleigh, barely visible in the dim light. Evelyn's stomach churned as she stepped back, her mind racing. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the room, a deep, guttural laugh that sent chills down her spine. Evelyn spun around, but the room was empty. The laugh echoed again, louder this time, and the sleigh began to shake. She stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Back in the main corridor, Evelyn leaned against the wall, her breathing ragged. She tried to radio her supervisor again, but all she heard was static. She turned toward the Christmas Village display in the atrium, hoping to lose herself in the crowd of shoppers. But when she arrived, the scene was eerily still. The children who had been lined up to meet Santa were gone, and the fake snow-covered display looked wrong. The lights flickered, casting unsettling shadows across the mannequins in Santa's workshop. Evelyn's eyes were drawn to the Santa mannequin in particular. It wasn't a mannequin. Evelyn approached the display cautiously. The Santa figure sat in his chair, a wide grin stretched across his face. But as she got closer, she noticed the subtle movements. The way his chest seemed to rise and fall as if breathing, the twitch of his gloved fingers. Her radio crackled, and a child's voice whispered through the static. "Help me." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She glanced around, but the atrium was empty. The Santa figure tilted its head slightly, its glassy eyes locking onto hers. "Who's there?" Evelyn called, her voice shaking. The Santa figure stood, its joints creaking unnaturally. It took a single step forward, and Evelyn stumbled back. The lights in the atrium went out, plunging her into darkness. In the pitch black, Evelyn heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. The sound echoed, growing closer. She fumbled for her flashlight, but when she turned it on, the beam flickered weakly. The Santa figure was gone. A shadow moved across the far wall, impossibly large. Evelyn turned to run, but her path was blocked by the Christmas sleigh from the storage room. It shouldn't have been there. The sleigh's carvings glowed faintly, and the guttural laugh returned, louder than ever. Evelyn felt her knees buckle as the air grew heavier, pressing against her chest. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her shoulder. She turned, expecting to see the Santa figure, but it was her supervisor, Carl. "Evelyn," he shouted. "What's going on?" Before she could answer, the sleigh began to move, its wheels screeching against the floor. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in red, but nothing like Santa Claus. Its face was skeletal, its grin impossibly wide. In one hand, it held a massive, rusted bell. The figure raised the bell, and the sound that followed wasn't a chime. It was a scream. Evelyn Reed had always thought of herself as rational, a grounded person who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But now, standing face to face with a skeletal figure cloaked in red, she couldn't deny the horror unfolding before her. The sleigh wasn't just an old prop, it was something far darker. And Evelyn was about to discover its terrifying purpose. The skeletal figure raised the rusted bell, its deafening scream echoing through the atrium. Evelyn dropped to her knees, covering her ears as the sound reverberated through her body. The lights flickered violently, casting disjointed shadows across the room. Carl grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her to her feet. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the bell's wail. Evelyn nodded, her legs shaky. Together, they bolted toward the nearest exit, weaving through the Christmas display. But no matter how far they ran, the bell sound seemed to follow them, growing louder with each step. As they reached the corridor leading to the exit, Evelyn glanced over her shoulder. The skeletal figure was no longer alone. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the sleigh, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV. They moved in unison, their eyeless faces fixed on Evelyn and Carl. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. "We're not going to make it," Carl gasped, his voice filled with panic. Evelyn refused to stop. She knew them all better than anyone, knew its shortcuts and hidden corridors. If she could just reach the security office, she could lock them inside and call for help. The security office was only a few doors away when the fluorescent lights above them shattered, plunging the hall into darkness. Evelyn's flashlight flickered weakly, casting fleeting glimpses of the approaching shadows. Carl stumbled, his hand slipping from Evelyn's grip. She turned to help him, but one of the shadowy figures surged forward, its shape twisting into something long and jagged. "No!" Evelyn screamed as the shadow engulfed Carl. His scream was cut short, replaced by a choking silence. Evelyn backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadows shifted, their movements deliberate. She could feel their malice, their hunger. She reached the security office, slamming the door behind her. The room was cramped, filled with old monitors and filing cabinets. Evelyn locked the door and leaned against it, her chest heaving. The monitors crackled to life, displaying grainy footage of the atrium. The sleigh was glowing now, its carvings pulsating with a sickly light. The skeletal figure stood beside it, its bell silent, but still menacing. Around the sleigh, the shadows swirled like a living storm. On one of the monitors, Evelyn saw herself, standing in the security office. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. Evelyn turned toward the window, her heart pounding. The skeletal figure was standing outside, its eyeless gaze fixed on her. It raised the bell again, but this time, there was no sound. Instead, the door behind her began to creak. The lock twisted on its own, and the shadows seeped in through the cracks. Evelyn grabbed the nearest weapon, a heavy flashlight, and swung it wildly as the shadows closed in. But it was no use. The next morning, Hillside Mall opened as usual. Shoppers filled the halls, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded the night before. Evelyn's disappearance was never reported, and the security office was eerily clean, as though she had never been there. The Christmas display remained untouched and pristine, but those who passed by claimed they could hear faint footsteps and the distant sound of a bell. And every year on Christmas Eve, the lights in the atrium would flicker and the shadows would grow longer. The Hillside Mall's Christmas Eve was supposed to end with laughter, family, and festive cheer. Instead, it became a night that would haunt the few who dared to remember it. Evelyn Reed's story didn't end in the security office. The truth of what happened that night would ripple far beyond the mall's walls, leaving questions no one could answer and horrors no one could escape. The security office was silent now. The monitors flickered one by one, their static reflecting an empty atrium. But if anyone had been there to watch closely, they would have seen something strange. The Christmas display wasn't empty. The skeletal figure, cloaked in its tattered red robe, stood motionless beside the sleigh. The rusted bell hung loosely in its hand, its silence more unnerving than its scream. Around the sleigh, shadows moved like living smoke, coiling and uncoiling in rhythmic patterns. And Evelyn, she was standing there too. Her face was blank, her eyes wide and unblinking. She held the bell now, her hand trembling slightly as though fighting an unseen force. The following day, mall employees noticed changes in the Christmas display. The Santa figure was gone, replaced by something that looked almost human, but not quite. Its face was pale, its grin unnaturally wide. The sleigh had been moved closer to the center of the atrium, its carvings glowing faintly in the sunlight streaming through the glass ceiling. No one questioned the changes. No one dared to. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences plagued the Hillside Mall. Shoppers reported hearing footsteps behind them, only to find no one there. Security guards refused to work the late shifts, citing unexplainable incidents. And then there were the disappearances. One evening, a janitor named Luis was cleaning the atrium when he noticed the sleigh's carvings glowing faintly. He moved closer, curiosity overriding his fear. As he leaned in, he heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But the words were unmistakable. "Come closer." Luis backed away, but his feet wouldn't move. The sleigh seemed to pull at him, its glow intensifying. The next morning, his cleaning cart was found abandoned in the atrium. Luis was never seen again. Evelyn's disappearance had become a hushed topic among the staff, a story whispered in backrooms and break rooms. But no one dared speak openly about what they suspected. And those who worked in the mall at night began to notice something strange on the monitors. A figure, cloaked in red, would appear in the atrium at precisely midnight. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood beside the sleigh, holding the bell. The footage always cut to static after a few seconds, leaving the guards uneasy and reluctant to investigate. The mall's owners dismissed the reports, blaming overworked employees and faulty equipment. But behind closed doors, they knew the truth. Hillside Mall had always been different, built on land once used for strange rituals. Its foundations carried an energy that couldn't be explained. The sleigh had been found during construction, buried deep beneath the ground. The carvings were studied but never understood, and the sleigh was quietly added to the Christmas display without fanfare. Now, it was clear that the sleigh wasn't just an artifact. It was a beacon. On Christmas Eve the following year, the mall closed early. The owners claimed it was a precautionary measure, but those who worked there knew better. At midnight, the atrium lights flickered to life. The skeletal figure stood by the sleigh, the rusted bell swinging in its hand. And beside it stood Evelyn, her eyes glowing faintly as she raised her hand. The bell tolled once, its sound reverberating through the empty halls. The shadows surged forward, spilling out of the atrium and into the corridors. For the first time, the mall wasn't empty. It was filled with them. Hillside Mall still stands today, its halls filled with shoppers unaware of its history. But every Christmas Eve, the lights flicker and the shadows grow longer. And if you listen closely, you might hear it, the faint toll of a bell calling to those who dare to enter.